Hi, I am Malice, and this is BD Mancy. I hope you'll enjoy this comic design essay. Chainsaw Man, Tatsuki Fujimoto's monstrous manga, is known for its drawings and its spectacular visual storytelling. We will see here in detail the way he tells the supernatural through the idea of overflowing images, of off-screen, and a recontextualization of the comic space. We will then look at a concrete example of his use of all this, through the passage taking place in Hell, and in which he will seek to disorient his reader. Once this is done, for the conclusion, we can ask ourselves whether or not Fujimoto is a meta-author in his use of the codes of comics. Thank you and good video to you. The image that overflows the panel boundaries is one of its most showy visual storytelling, so flashy and explicit that it would perhaps be enough on its own without explanations. But let's see if there is a way to dissect this to get some interesting thoughts, in addition to our instinctive feeling. First, to reinforce the personality of this setting, the arms and the hands are extremely present in this manga. They are regularly put forward for various reasons and thus have a particular value, among others, because they are used as tools of summoning and as a relay to the demonic presence. A relay both in the story itself and in Fujimoto's storyboard. The arms and the hands are going to be very regularly valued by overflows in any kind, and to accompany them in their purpose of representation of the supernatural. But to begin with, let's look at the ways in which the overflow principle can be found in more discrete and common examples. It can be used to emphasize a drawing more than the other panels on the page, to represent a character moving forward in the space of a place, or to reinforce the link between two elements that are not within the same panel. Otherwise, more basically, it brings graphic variety to a page, as can also the absence of panel outlines in the page composition. It is therefore a use of the page space and its structures that can reinforce the creation of meaning in the images. There are a lot of variations, and for example, the image can multiply the overflow on several structures at the same time, such as passing through a panel, a margin, and the edge of the page at the same time. This multiplication of overflows further marks the connection and passage between several distinct spaces. It's more rare, and for the comics that use this recurrently, apart from Chainsaw Man, I found quite a lot of this kind of visual in Invincible, which in general uses the overflows particularly well, as shown in this superb panel. I also found this in several Spider-Man, which seems to be a fairly common signature of this character and which marks his superhuman ability. Fujimoto also uses the overflow in all these different configurations and thus in a rather classical way, but what will interest us here is when he does it in a more personal way, to transform the space of a comic book by giving it a demonic nature. The space that serves as a foundation for the comic is the white of the paper, which by default is often perceived as neutral and discrete. The drawing that overflows will often use it to mark its crossing, which can at the same time revalue this space. In Chainsaw Man, this space perceived as empty will take on the status of a magical dimension. There are several ways to make the white of the page more active. Basically, the page blank already has different states and roles, such as the margin or the gutter. The routine of these elements can be broken, for example by enlarging a gutter to indicate a greater transition in time and/or place. The white background can also be enclosed by a panel, which gives it more of a drawing status. In fact, in comics without colour, white already often intrudes into the compositions. But a powerful way to recall it to our eyes is to change its context. For example, by making it participate in the atmosphere of a snowy space, by giving it a role of purgatory where a character will wander, or by transforming it into a space illuminated by light or music, which is an important visual storytelling in the manga Dobugawa, whose narration of silence and the unspoken goes a lot through the valorization of empty spaces. In Chainsaw Man, as the supernatural is omnipresent in the story, and as the white space of the page is explicitly and repeatedly used for this purpose, it becomes a constant potential opening to this other dimension. The worlds of humans and demons are deeply blended, and the supernatural can pop up at any moment. This contextualization allows Fujimoto to use a visual setting very similar to other comics, but in addition giving it another dimension. For example, the magical summoning of a wolf or a fox by a hand gesture is an idea that can be found both in Jujutsu Kaisen and in Chainsaw Man. However, in the second one, the symbolism carried by the overflow, the white of the page, and the valorization of the layout reinforces the purpose and thus the force of this gesture. Another example where here we have a character who arrives brutally and whose action is enhanced by the spatial distribution. In Chainsaw Man there is all this, but in addition the demonic nature of the character comes to share to the space of the page and it structures its supernatural dimension. The settings and situations are very similar, but the context is not the same, which largely changes the deal. This emphasis on the intimate interaction that exists in all comics between the characters and the layout of the page leads us to a particularity of comics as regards its extra-diegetic elements. Quick summary: intra-diegetic is when it is internal to the story, so the characters, what they do, the scenery, etc. Extradiegetic is when it is external to the story, the black bars of the film, the name of the actor that appears during the credits, etc. The typical example is music in movies. When it comes from a radio, it's an intradiegetic sound. When it's music that the characters can't hear, like the soundtrack of the movie, it's an extradiegetic sound. This is an example that has its limits, as in the musical comedy moments, but anyway, in art you have to accept that all rules are spectres with blurred boundaries. In a comic book, the extradiegetic elements are very visible. The margin, the panels and their borders, or the book with its turning pages, or the telephone that we scroll through have a tangible and active physical presence in our hands. These elements, although often in the background in our perception, actively participate in the narrative and are very much mixed with the ongoing story. There is an idea of constant back and forth in the creation of meaning between the drawn elements and the architecture of the page. This can naturally push authors to make their characters use this external architecture in an explicit way, even without ever entering into a meta-discourse. For example, the border of a panel can become a floor, a wall, or a ceiling. The white background can intrude into the panels and participate in the atmosphere and intimacy of a scene. The format of the panel can constantly adapt to the scene in progress. And, as the theorist Benoit Peters had noticed, the action of turning a page can accompany the action of the character who opens a door and make us enter a new environment with him. In the comics, there is thus a constant and visible tension in the blurred boundary between external code and concrete element of fiction, all placed on the same level, that of the drawing placed on a flat 2D surface. For example, a speech bubble has a strong visual presence and a character will be able to feel it, but for all that, it is implicit that the speech bubble does not have the same physical presence as a scenery, however apparent it may be. As a result, in Chainsaw Man, in these moments of overflow, we don't know what the humans perceive, which means that we have both a very explicit and graphic representation of the intervention of the supernatural, while keeping a very powerful blur on the real perception that the humans have whose senses are overwhelmed. A blur that is brought very easily because it is maintained in almost all the comics. A character lives in panels in the eyes of all, and even when he interacts explicitly with, it is leave untold. More generally in this manga, the showy use of comic book codes tends to remind us of their presence, but Fujimoto will also emphasize the existence of the panels, gutters and margins by giving them a quite active aspect by the drawing within the panels to suggest them even within the fiction. For example, there is this type of visual of using a door as a separation gutter, and thus mixing the visual and the role of an intradiegetic element with a usually extradiegetic code, and even more generally, an opaque line that crosses a panel can have a dimension or even a role as a gutter in a comic book, which will naturally singularize this kind of composition. And in this game with the codes, we can also see a kind of self-parody in this page where the hand is showed in a strange way, but to represent an action yet very down to earth. We can find that this insistence is sometimes done in a way that seems a bit gratuitous and pointless. However, I find that the role of these visuals is to keep us attentive to the spaces on the page, so that we don't put them too far aside in our minds, even when there is not such a showy visual storytelling as some of its overflows can be. To keep us attentive to the structures to always suggest the constant underlying presence of the supernatural and its potential concrete arrival that can happen at any moment. We have seen here that the comic book is a very powerful medium to tell a world located between the visible and the invisible. The blur of perceptions maintained in this manga is also maintained by the use of the off-screen, a very important element and very much used by Fujimoto. First of all, let's note that it can be enhanced by his very good mastery of well-composed drawings. In fact, the off-screen is a standard often discrete in a comic book because basically each panel of a comic is a framing that will cut a part of our vision. In Chainsaw Man, the off-screen is singularized because it can, in adequacy with the architecture of the page, become a supernatural zone which will push us to be more conscious of the existence of what is not visible and out of the frame. So this gives it a common point with the structures of the page that we have already talked about just before, and besides, the white of the page can of course be part of this off-field, but we can go further than that in the analysis. In all, I think I can count 3 different types of off-screen that are used in this double world idea. There is the element that comes from the edge of the page, from the outside of the comic book itself, and therefore from a zone that exceeds that of the physical and reachable reality of the characters. We could even imagine an inverted off-screen. A character stretches his arm towards the outside of the page to bring back an object from the world of demons. Then there is the most classic case in comics, the off-screen cut off by the panel. In cases of representation of the supernatural, the panel becomes a portal that can open up to another world whose narrow framing prevents us from fully understanding the globality of the action, which we could then rationalize too much. This idea of a portal is even more true when the magic element opens the edge of the panel and creates an opening. And finally, there is the off-screen which takes place within the page but which overflows the cut of the gutter. It is a rather special off-screen allowed by the principle of juxtaposed panels. An off-screen shown in a visible way because the element that overflows on the neighboring panel puts us in a situation where we don't know what the character really perceives, if what is outside his panel is a complete off-screen for him. Also, the white outside the panels takes even more actively in charge this idea of parallel dimension. Outside the panels, the space of the page becomes more explicitly the space of the fiction and no longer an extra-diegetic space. We are not anymore only in the purely symbolic representation of the panel arrangement. The visual storytelling between these two examples is apparently the same, but in Chainsaw Man, we are more in the idea of a panoramic panel, that is to say a group of panels in which the images are prolonged, but which here are freed from the real space by a magical logic. Fujimoto insists on the idea of a false panoramic and false connection by cutting off the hand of the character in the background who is doing exactly the same action. Thanks to this idea of off-screen coupled with the crossing of dimensions, some drawings take another flavor in this manga which, in a less showy way, also evoke this idea. Like when Beam comes out of a wall, when Aki plunges his head into a demon without us seeing his point of view, or when the drawing of a severed hand ends with a framing suggesting an off-screen, while we know that there is nothing more afterwards. The off-screen also allows Fujimoto to enhance the value of a seemingly simple visual. For example here, even if we know that Denji pulls the cord connected to his chest and heart to start his transformation, the simple fact of showing only the pulling hand implies better the supernatural origin of this action. Because of the particular status of the hand in close-up in this manga coupled with the off-screen and sometimes also the overflow, we have here the suggestion of the inaccessible and the invisible world. And yet Denji pulling his chainsaw cord is a physical action that we know that we can easily relate to in our experience of reality and also in this manga, that it is easy to represent mentally. But in Chainsaw Man, the symbolic image of this moment pushes us to charge it with meaning and purpose that goes beyond this simple action in itself. By this framing and this context, it becomes a magical summoning. What is funny is that Goscinny and Morris, during the long evolution of the visual storytelling of Lucky Luke's shooting, had also arrived at this idea. The man who shoots faster than his shadow has a supernatural power, and in the comics, the representation of speed being partly open to subjectivity, from volume 11 onwards, his action is very often suggested from an off-screen to place him outside the physical possibilities of human understanding and of the representable. In Chainsaw Man, as in Lucky Luke, we have here an action that we think we can imagine, but which is presented as being outside the rational and the limits of our brain, and which is therefore shrouded in mystery. I made a study on this aspect of Lucky Luke, which I intend to transcribe in English on this channel, as well as many other analyses. We can see that authors Erok, Stee and Liturgy also use this idea more lightly in the comic book The Teachers, where the running gag of the student Boulard who receives a chalk throw on the head by his English teacher is here realized from a computer screen, which is of course absurd and impossible. As a result, the edge of the panel is mixed with the verticality of the screen shown from the side on the previous panel, and the action is also shown here from a point outside our perceptions. In the creation of meaning of these supernatural actions, the instantaneity of the still image that composes the comics also has a very active role. We will see that quickly here. In the comics, to build the sense of the story, we rely a lot on games of comparisons between the images. By showing key moments, we will understand the course of an action in a fluid way, whereas this one is shown only by fragmented pieces. There is no need to mentally reconstruct the missing parts. It is the images well chosen by the author and placed in a distinct way that take in charge the implicit of the totality of the action. These links can be made in a linear way in the direct order of reading, but also in a non-linear way, at a greater distance. In this process, there is an idea of suddenness because each new image is present at once. And we add to this the narrative logic and the flow of the reading to inscribe more of an idea of gradual progression. In Chainsaw Man, all this also helps to manage this blurring of reality in the appearances. These overflows that indicate the supernatural don't come gradually, they are there, suddenly in the panel as a state of fact. If we stop to think about it, we can eventually consciously reconstitute in our head the stages of a progressive movement. But most of the time, the flow of the reading allows us to fulfill this conscious act, and we remain rather in a very convenient blur that allows to show an element at the same time instanced and progressive. Without that, this tension between two opposite elements needs to be clear. A temporal paradox that takes its strength from the fact that it does not have to be resolved, a kind of functional Schrodinger's cat. The comic book aspect of jumping from key moment to key moment is very handy for bringing a supernatural dimension to space, motion and time. Now that all that is set up, let's look at some concrete examples. To start with, we can see how his signature visual storytelling is brought gradually for the introduction of the first volume, which is an approach that I will discuss in another video, through the Manga Spy X family and the idea of tutorial in the comics. First of all, on the second page of the manga, there is this panel that seems ordinary and that does not yet suggest its real implication and that we understand then backwards or during a rereading. Then, during the pact between Pochita and Denji, the symbolism of the arm coming from an off-screen continues to be gently reinforced. It is only after they are slaughtered that the visual becomes a little more explicitly supernatural, as the blood connecting them is superimposed on the vertical strip, and thus the extra diegetic space. And thanks to this segmentation into 3 parts, the blood thus comes from an off-screen from Pochita's point of view. However, here we still have a logical panorama. The blood, the internal images, and the onomatopoeia extend directly through the panels. Then the supernatural is reinforced, because we come back to a vertical strip in 3 panels with the bloodline superimposed, which thus operates a strong link with the previous visual to mark its evolution. Because here the panels are freed from the panorama and Fujimoto has well marked the lack of connection between each panel background. We can see that now the link goes beyond the physical logic and uses the space of the comics to create an environment where magic can take place. Magic that will then link on the left panel both the arm and the panels in a single united piece. And of course the choice of the arm as a demonstration of the arrival of Denji's power is not innocent. Further on, Denji starts his transformation for the first time, and his arm that pulls the rope is drawn in such a way that it looks partly independent from the rest of his body. The arm is all white where Denji is greyed, and the rather horizontal arm is cut in the left edge of the panel to give him the link with the visual storytelling coming from an off-screen. We will find this idea also with the Bat Demon. His first chainsaw stroke emerges from the mass of zombies, so still from a hidden point of view, and also to create an effect of expectation and surprise. Then the page is turned, and Chainsaw Man emerges on the right in an almost full-page image with a piece of chainsaw starting to overflow from the panel, which makes a link with the spread page that follows, where he slices the zombie devil by crossing his arm from one page to the other, which is again another use of the space offered by the comic book and of the crossing of 2 distinct spaces, in this case the physical fold of the book, which also gives a kind of off-screen visual to the chainsaw. Even though between his 2 large representations of Denji there was a page where he advances his movement, we see that the common locations of Denji on the 2 double page operate a strong narrative link. On the first, he starts to overflow, and on the second double page he finally occupies the whole space. Moreover, while Denji seems to follow an idea of panorama spread over the 2 pages with the direct extension of his arm and thus to have only one temporality arranged in 2 times, the head of the demon is represented twice in a very distinct way in 2 different spaces. Once again, we have 2 temporalities that seem to be strangely mixed. The chainsaw first goes through the eye and the head of the enemy, and then the enemy rises to detach itself from it, leaving a flow of blood that indicates its movement. A supernatural attack to kill a supernatural being whose visual also accentuates the idea of chaos and carnage. At the end of the first volume, we finally reach this page I've already talked about before, and which, without necessarily giving the appearance of it, shows a certain apogee in the visual storytelling of transformation. A face-to-face between 2 hands coming from an off-screen which, despite their difference in size, can represent a fight of equal demonic. Let's take a second example, this time from Volume 8. In Chapter 63, in order to send his enemies to hell, this assassin, who is known as Santa Claus, offers to the Hell Devil the heart of his old puppet as well as 3 children. The 4 identical panels where the children are can represent the same moment shown on 4 different characters, or they can represent a time that is passing. The comics allow us to keep this data ambiguous without it bothering us, and without us having to wonder about it. On the other hand, since most of the time a sequence of panels equals a passage of time, unless there is a really strong visual indicator, we tend to transpose this idea, even when it is not imposed. However, the plus layout and common size of the panels, as well as the lack of bubbles and movement lines, contribute to this idea of undetermined time and flexibility in its interpretation. Then we have a beautiful use of the repetition of the same image, which often also implies the repetition of the format of the panel where it is located. It is a type of visual that can be the result of a constraint of authors pressed by time and work and who therefore make a sort of recycling of their panels, but which can also be reappropriated and voluntarily exploited to enhance its storytelling, as we will see in my future video analysis of a fight in Invincible. The repetition of images is also a type of visual that comes up several times in Chainsaw Man and in a very nice way. Here we have an immobility arranged in 2 times which makes the appearance of the Hell Devil's finger even more disturbing. It leads us to ask ourselves questions. Was time already frozen in the first panel, or is it only frozen from the second one? But is time really frozen, or is it just that the demonic intervention is beyond the physical and temporal laws of our world? After seeing this image, I looked again at the previous 4 panels to see if the physical representation of the children was already the same, which it is not. So the time ran out when we moved to the left page. However, they were already represented there without a line of movement or a dialogue bubble, while they were moving and talking. The break between these 2 passages is not clear enough for me to decide whether the demon's space-time distortion influence was already present on the right page or not. Just a few moments ago, I didn't even have to wonder about these 4 panels, and now their ambiguity bothers me. And then, the 3 children seem to be erased under the finger. Will they disappear entirely, or just their heads? And what is the gesture of this finger? Is it going to teleport them, crush them under it on place, or pull them out of the page? Does the remaining child perceive the horrible finger which freezes her in fear, or will her friends just disappear without her understanding the situation? All this is left in mystery. It will not be explained. The reader will remain in the anguish of uncertainty. Uncertainty which we are, however, quite used to in comics. The sound is often present without being represented. The time that passes is rarely perfectly defined. The movements are above all suggested, etc. A flexibility of mind which here, rather than freeing us from a mental load, comes on the contrary to disturb us. And as I mentioned before, the sudden appearance of a comic book panel gives this finger both the idea of a sudden appearance, but which we can also imagine arrived gradually from the right, where it left the edge of the panel open to the white of the margin, which became a supernatural space. The 2 paradoxical theories coexist, and in any case, everything here sounds like a horrible intrusion against which we are powerless. In the idea of this intervention of the supernatural, at the same time impactful but ambiguous in its perception, on the following double page, the characters in the building are surrounded by the darkness triggered just before by the sacrifice of the old man and the children. What is interesting here is that the author has made a clear separation between the 2 facing pages, the inside of the building trapped in the curse, and the view of the characters outside. They are already no longer in the same world and therefore no longer in the same page. To go in this direction, on the left page, it's interesting to note that Fujimoto showed his characters looking towards the sky and thus towards the huge hand that comes just after, but taking care not to represent his characters and the giant hand in the same visible space of the comic, not even by its shadow. A progressive increase in tension brought by the distribution of the space of his pages, and we remain in this idea of using the space of the comic to maintain an ambiguity on the real perception that the characters have on the supernatural. We don't know what they see, the double-page spread of the 6-fingered hand showing no living person and therefore no witness. In the manga Flow by Yuki Urushibara, for the time of a chapter, there is a visual storytelling whose philosophy is very close to that of Chainsaw Man. The characters are confronted to a supernatural phenomenon that rounds all the angles of a district. This rounding is done as well in the scenery itself as on the corners of the panels. We are also here, even if it is more sober and less insistent, in this idea that the supernatural will be both powerful and ambiguous by making it expressed by an external structure of the comic which impacts our feeling that we will project on the feeling of the characters. To finish this video, we will see the way in which the author is going to push all the mechanisms that we have already seen, including the disorientation, by playing with our habits of comics readers. We continue the scene that we have just analysed, which dives us directly in hell. The loss of control is a very present anguish in Chainsaw Man. To be overtaken by our determinism, to be dominated by superior forces, all this is represented in various ways in this manga. Among others through the idea of demons and bosses so powerful and untouchable that we come to wonder if feigning ignorance and letting ourselves take control by becoming their nice doggy is not the best possible outcome. Whatever our choice, town mouse or country mouse, there is always a price to pay, a contract and debts to which we submit our body and our labor force. This antagonism can logically be embodied by an abusive father, or by a control devil boss working under the protection of the government who wears a uniform and a tie and has a seductive and deceptively candid air. Or by an overwhelming force with complicated rules that can only be destabilized in one way, by uncontrollable marginality. As we have already seen during this video, the theme of an invisible force taking control of our lives is very much emphasized by the visual storytelling of Overflow and Offscreen. But in Hell, the loss of control will be felt more than ever, and this will come through the nature of this parallel dimension, through the Darkness Devil, and also once again through Fujimoto's storyboarding. All this will push the reader towards a feeling of disorientation. We are facing the demons of primary fears in front of which everyone loses all his marks. Besides, it's not surprising to see YouTubers making videos explaining this moment and putting back in order the arc that contains this passage. Even from a simple point of view of the story, this part can already be hard to follow even if we have been attentive enough during our reading. The first time you read this passage, I don't think it is possible to be completely at ease and in a totally coherent and rational reading. We have seen that the alteration of reality was already very strong with the 2 full-page images of the hand that grabs the building to remove the characters. Then, the arrival in Hell is logically marked by an accentuation of this layout. A spread page which shows that the whole environment has been radically altered. The world of humans has disappeared, only that of the demons remains, where their reign is absolute. Contrary to the previous double page, which had large illustrations, on this double page spread there is no longer any gutter or margin, and the sky fragmented into doors can represent organic intradiegetic panels, a materialization of potential openings to other worlds. A heavy threat on the head of these characters, which is a concrete incarnation of the danger in which they live every day. This context will allow, among other things, to give the Darkness Devil a more sober visual storytelling of his arm, which does not interfere from outside the page or the gutter, but just comes from a very classic off-screen of the panel. He is at home, he does not have to cross a dimension to intervene. And then on the contrary, when the arm of the Hell Devil is shown bringing a piece of flesh to a human in our world, the panel is pierced because we are again in this idea of intrusion. Two different statements illustrated by two different settings whose difference is really made with very few things. But above all, this context of the hell will allow Fujimoto to justify a visual storytelling that frees itself even more from the rules by pushing its narration even more towards surrealism and the absurd. For example, by using the ripped-off arms to make outlines and gutters of separation. By using panels of a frog drawing which we don't understand neither its meaning nor its location in the place and the action. Or by showing the Hell Devil operating a teleportation by using his fingers to mark a transition of place, as it is classically done in other comics by a progressive division of a panel, or also more rarely and especially discreetly than here, by using an element of scenery being able to recall this division. In Hell, it is no longer just the symbolic space of the page that is used to bring the supernatural into the setting, it is the space of fiction where the characters evolve that has become a space where the symbolic has materialized. In Chainsaw Man, a demon exists and is fed by the fears of humans, so it makes sense that a symbol is a concrete force for him and an extension of his body. In fact, it is quite logical to see this here if we understand Fujimoto's use of comic book code since the beginning of this manga, that is a representation of the supernatural. This visual remains nevertheless surprising and can already disorientate the reader, who will wonder even more what the characters who suffer it really perceive, and the uncertainty of this questioning is even more put to the test. For example, in this page of My Hero Academia, there is also the use of the hand to delimit panels, but here it is more a symbolic idea of a dominating character who is in a position of strength and speed. In Chainsaw Man, the difference is that the symbolic management of the space of the page is also materialized and justified in the intradiegetic space. The characters are conditioned and are subjected by structures that they do not master, and which here are incarnated not by a uniform and a symmetrical building with right angles, but by an organic structure that cannot be rationalized. To go further in the analysis, I will now try to talk about the idea of disturbance of the reading process, which is a mechanism sometimes used in comics, often in the purpose of representing a disoriented character. We'll start with the arrival of the Darkness Devil, which is gradually forming. First, there is the black shape that crashes flat like a thick liquid. We can note that even if it crashes on the ground through management of the layout, it remains as shown above the characters to extend the idea of the threat incarnated by the doors in height, in a position of dominance. And then on the next page, the demon is represented as a long silhouette shaded in small cross-hatching. To me, there is something odd about the transition between these two representations. There would have been various ways to make this transformation smoother and more gradual, as seen in many comics, but that was not the author's choice. Moreover, on this left page, I wouldn't be surprised if some readers thought that the astronaut at the end of the page was a closer shot of this shadow, as this kind of picture-to-picture link is easily made in comics, and maybe even more so in an almost silent page where we only have the drawings to focus on. We gradually arrive at the idea that Fujimoto will try to disorient us by playing on our well-conditioned reader's experience. This will become more obvious later on. On the next page, we have the satanic scene of the astronauts. One amazing thing about this superb page is again its suddenness, its lack of transition. We were certainly partly prepared thanks to the panel of the astronaut just before, even if it could already be confusing, and the fact of turning the page helps to make a transition. But these astronauts who pray seem to come out of nowhere. We didn't see them gradually emerging from the ground, if that's where they come from. And at the time it's hard to understand the reason for this very symbolic image. Same thing for the frog on the left, which is surrounded by darkness, and whose croak, the only text of the double page and thus of clear temporal indication which is isolated here, seems to trigger the moment of the shadow which spreads on the panel below. On this sequence of silent panels without a line of movement, and perhaps even more strongly on this duo of twin panels, we return to the ambiguity that mixes action in progress and fixity of the characters, already seen before. On the next double page, and again after that, we continue the abruptness of the image and the absence of movement line, which are important to maintain the confusion. The actions are teleported from frozen moment to frozen moment. It is difficult to reconstruct an idea of temporal continuity between the panels, whereas usually we do it without even thinking about it in the flow of the reading. So the demon has suddenly removed the arms of his victims and seems to have teleported into the middle of them. With the arms in his own body, if we notice it, he writes the name of Makima. This is yet another way of incarnating and making organic, mystical and occult a graphic code common in comics, which in addition here has a three-dimensional aspect, but which is nevertheless presented right in front of us, in such a way that, from our point of view as readers, we can read it. It's a writing positioning that only makes sense if there is a viewer well positioned in relation to it. And this time of observation that we can take to decipher each letter before understanding its meaning is not the equivalent of pausing a movie. It is a type of rhythm that can be integrated willingly in some comics, for example by integrating hidden messages, as it was done in the French comic L'Infoiste. And then we turn the page and, still as abruptly, we arrive on a confusion brought by the gutter arms, as already explained before, but also by the reading order, which is disturbed by the arrangement of the panels. And then the arms are shown again in the first panel of the next page, so in the direct following of our linear reading, and we don't understand what brought the arms from one situation to another, always so suddenly. This use of the arms as an extra diegetic graphic code will reinforce the way in which the demon, itself composed of many arms, will inhabit the panels. The structures of the page become a kind of extension of his body. He appropriates and fully dominates the space of the page, the supernatural dimension. And despite all this confusion, in the following double page, the author nevertheless manages to fluidly integrate a flashback using a clear and sharp black background that then allows us to switch back to a white background, but this time in the human world, on the character of Santa Claus. This scene will be concluded by the end of the chapter, which allows a new direct dive into hell from the first page of the next chapter. Moreover, the first scene in hell ended with a long panel at the very top of the page showing a close-up of Denji talking, and then, to make the link, the return to hell logically starts in the same way with the continuation of his monologue. This succession of transitions, helped by the management of the space, is really very well done, very clear and elegant, and all the more remarkable considering the confusion that the author had installed just before. So after a sentence of Denji to introduce the chapter, we come back to a silence with motionless actions. The Darkness Devil is suddenly shown holding Tolka in his hand, with then the use of a zoom divided on two panels, which gives another perception on the physical distance of the characters. This use of the facing images to mislead the real distances and to enhance the symbolism is also a visual storytelling that Fujimoto seems to appreciate. Then, still in a sudden way, he removes Tolka's head, and the black surrounding and delimiting them also contributes to this impression of a strange non-movement action. And if the decapitation image had been directly juxtaposed with the previous panels, we would have better integrated the idea of a continuous action shown over several panels. But here we have turned the page, and the link of a fluid action is therefore less effective. We remain in this idea of rhythm punctuated by suddenness and stuttering moments. Also in this page we have again a game of comparisons that leads to confusion. The ripped-off head of Tolka, juxtaposed with a close-up of a head resembling him, can push us to make a connection that doesn't really have to be made. It also further emphasizes the fact that Tolka, both body and head, have suddenly disappeared from the panels and the demon's arm. From here on, the characters come out of their stupefaction and go on the offensive, so logically the lines of speed and movement reappear. Anyway, all along this confrontation we will stay in a strange rhythm of linking operations between panels that don't have to be, of sudden and teleported actions, of representations of strange body movements. To go into the details of each of these moments would be too long for you and laborious for me, and you have understood the idea. Even if it is not the strongest one I have presented here, I wanted to try to talk about it. Putting words on our reading process of a comic and the impressions we get from it is not the most easy of exercises, and the part of subjectivity and personal habits is quite big. But as this is not the only time in the manga that the author uses the ambiguous silence and the strange connections to indicate an idea of confusion, maybe we could still see a real intention of the author. Anyway, we can go to the conclusion.
Je dis méchant pour ne pas dire satanique. Satanique? S'ils sont pas reptiliens, sont au moins sataniques. Satanique? Faire tourner le monde grâce à l'usure, c'est un peu satanique. Des fois le coca c'est moins cher que l'eau, c'est un peu satanique. Hey.
In Chainsaw Man, things that seem to be opposed cohabit. We have characters that want to be detached and often have a cold look, but caught in the line of a drawing that makes them fragile and hypersensitive. We have loving first degree and destructive nihilism, drama mixed with Z-movie. We also have the intimate cooperation of extradiegetic and intradiegetic codes whose nature is ultimately very close. Everything remains just a fixed drawing on paper to which we will give meaning and life. We have seen the purpose of Fujimoto's insistence on the existence of the architecture of his pages, and as you may have already understood, but for me, contrary to the reputation that is sometimes given to this author, I don't think that Fujimoto can be said to be an author who is in meta or fourth wall breaking, because of this norm in comics to be in this ambiguous mixture of reality between intra and extra diegetic codes. An ambiguity that Fujimoto never completely crosses, thanks to the fact that he never makes explicit the real perception that his characters have of these structures. Even if all this is on a tight edge, it is never sliced in favor of the meta. I hope you enjoyed this first BDmancy video, where we saw how comics can powerfully carry a story thanks to its rich storytelling tools. If you did, you can support me on Patreon so that this project of comics design studies can continue. Thanks to you, and see you soon for more videos.